On January 25, 1942, 12-year-old Tanya Savacheva opened her diary and wrote a short entry. Genya died on December 28 at 12 p.m. 1941. Genya was her sister. Over the following months, Tanya would record 5 more deaths. Grandma died January 25 at 3 p.m. 1942. Lika died March 17 at 5 a.m. 1942. Uncle Vazia died April 13 at 2 a.m. 1942. Uncle Lisha May 10 at 4 p.m. 1942. Mama on May 13 at 7:30 a.m. 1942. Then one final entry. Savachevs died. Everyone died. Only Tanya is left. Tanya Savacheva's diary, just 9 brief entries on a few pages, became one of the most powerful symbols of the siege of Leningrad. The deadliest siege in human history. 872 days when the city of over 3 million people was cut off from the outside world and left to starve. When over 1 million civilians died, most from hunger. When people ate sawdust bread, boiled leather belts, and things too horrible to speak about. When winter temperatures dropped to -40 degrees and there was no heat, no electricity, no water. When the dead lay in the streets because there was no one strong enough to bury them. This is the story of the siege of Leningrad. Hitler's attempt to starve an entire city to death. Stalin's refusal to evacuate civilians even when he knew they'd die. And the incredible endurance of ordinary people who survived 872 days of hell that some historians now classify as genocide. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, his surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, one of his primary targets was Leningrad. The city, named after Lenin, was the Soviet Union's second largest with over 3 million people. It was an industrial powerhouse with over 600 factories producing everything from tanks to munitions. It was the home of the Soviet Baltic Fleet. And it was the former imperial capital, St. Petersburg, the cultural heart of Russia. Hitler wanted Leningrad destroyed. Not captured. Destroyed. Wiped from the face of the earth. German Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, raced through the Baltic states in summer 1941. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Soviet forces retreated or were destroyed. By late August, German forces were approaching Leningrad from the south and west. Finnish forces, allied with Germany, advanced from the north. The city was being encircled. Leningrad's entire population mobilized. Men, women, even teenagers were put to work building defensive fortifications. They dug anti-tank trenches. They built concrete pillboxes. They created tank traps. Over 1 million civilians worked on these fortifications while 200,000 Red Army soldiers prepared to defend the city. But the defenses weren't ready. The Red Army wasn't prepared. And the Germans kept advancing. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured the town of Schlisselburg on Lake Ladoga, cutting the last land route into Leningrad. The city was now completely surrounded. The siege had begun. And inside Leningrad were over 3 million people with food supplies for about 30 days. Hitler's plan was simple and brutal. Starve Leningrad into submission. German scientists calculated the city would face mass starvation within weeks. No food could get in. No people could get out. The population would slowly die. Then German forces could walk into an empty city and demolish it. Hitler even had menus printed for a victory celebration at Leningrad's Astoria Hotel. He was that confident. But Hitler underestimated Soviet determination. And he didn't account for the one supply route the Germans couldn't completely cut. Lake Ladoga. The massive lake northeast of Leningrad remained in Soviet hands. In summer, barges could cross it carrying supplies. In winter, when the lake froze solid, trucks could drive across the ice. This became known as the Road of Life. It was Leningrad's only connection to the outside world. The first winter of the siege, 1941 to 1942, was the worst. Food supplies ran out almost immediately. By November, daily rations were reduced to starvation levels. Workers received 250 grams of bread per day. Office workers and dependents received just 125 grams. That's less than 3 slices. And the bread wasn't real bread. It was 50 to 60% sawdust, cellulose, and other inedible fillers mixed with a little flour. People ate everything they could find. Wallpaper paste made from potato starch. Petroleum jelly. Leather belts boiled for hours until soft enough to chew. Glue. Sawdust. Pet dogs and cats disappeared. Pigeons. Rats. Anything that could be remotely consumed was eaten. People scavenged through frozen garbage. They searched bombed-out buildings for any scraps. The cold was as deadly as the hunger. Winter temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 Fahrenheit. There was no heating fuel. Electricity was cut off to save power for the war factories. Water pipes froze. People burned furniture for warmth. They burned books. They burned anything that would combust. Families huddled together in single rooms, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, slowly freezing to death. The combination of starvation and cold created a condition called dystrophy. The body, deprived of nutrition, began consuming itself. Muscles wasted away. Faces became skeletal. Legs and arms thinned to sticks. The stomach swelled. People developed edema, fluid retention that made limbs puff up grotesquely. They lost their teeth. Their hair fell out. They moved in slow motion because they had no energy. And they died by the thousands every day. January 1942 was the worst month. Deaths peaked at over 100,000. That's 3,000 people dying every single day. The dead lay in the streets where they'd collapsed. Bodies piled up in courtyards and hallways. Families kept dead relatives in their apartments because they were too weak to carry them out and because the dead person's ration card could be used for a few more days before authorities discovered the death. Burial became impossible. The ground was frozen solid. There were too many bodies and too few people with strength to dig graves. Eventually, mass graves were dug using dynamite to break through the frozen earth. Bodies were brought on sleds, stacked in trucks, or simply dragged through the snow. At Piskaryovskoye Cemetery, 500,000 victims of the siege would eventually be buried in mass graves. The siege produced horrors that survivors struggled to speak about even decades later. Cannibalism appeared during that first terrible winter. Police records, kept secret until 2004, documented over 2,000 arrests for cannibalism. Some people killed to eat. Others scavenged from the dead. Parents hid their children. Stories spread of people lured into apartments and never seen again. Whether these stories were all true or exaggerated by fear and desperation remains unclear. But the terror was real. People were afraid of each other in ways that went beyond normal wartime fear. Yet even in hell, humanity persisted. The Leningrad radio continued broadcasting throughout the siege. When there was no news to report, they broadcast a metronome sound. Tick, tick, tick. Fast when there was an air raid. Slow during normal times. That sound let people know the radio, and therefore the city, was still functioning. It became the heartbeat of Leningrad. Poet Olga Bergholz became the voice of the siege. She broadcast poetry and updates on the radio. Her calm voice gave people something to hold on to. She'd been imprisoned during Stalin's purges. Her husband had been executed. She'd lost a child to NKVD brutality. Now she worked throughout the siege, her voice becoming a symbol of resistance and endurance. Composer Dmitri Shostakovich spent the early months of the siege in Leningrad. He composed his Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, while bombs fell and people starved. The symphony was performed in Leningrad on August 9, 1942 by the surviving members of the Leningrad Radio Symphony Orchestra. Many musicians had died of starvation. Those who remained were so weak they could barely hold their instruments. But they performed. And the music was broadcast on loudspeakers toward German lines, a defiant message that Leningrad still lived. Factories continued operating throughout the siege. Workers, starving and frozen, still showed up to build tanks and munitions. Production never stopped completely. The determination was incredible and horrifying. People literally working themselves to death to keep the war effort going. The road of life across Lake Ladoga was Leningrad's lifeline, but it was desperately inadequate. German artillery shelled the lake. Luftwaffe bombers attacked the supply convoys. In summer, barges sank from overloading or enemy action. In winter, trucks broke through thin ice and drowned. The first winter, The ice road barely functioned. Supplies trickling in weren't enough to prevent mass starvation. But the Soviets kept trying. By February 1942, the ice road was working more efficiently. More food came in. More evacuees went out. The situation remained desperate but slightly improved. People still died by the thousands, but not by the tens of thousands. By spring, some recovered enough strength to plant vegetable gardens in every available space. Parks, lawns, even anti-tank ditches were planted with cabbages and potatoes. Soviet attempts to break the siege failed repeatedly. In 1942, multiple offensives tried to punch through German lines and reopen land routes to the city. All failed with horrific casualties. The Germans were well dug in. Soviet forces attacking across open ground were slaughtered. But the attacks continued. Stalin refused to give up Leningrad. And German forces couldn't quite finish the city off. By 1943, over 1 million people had died, but Leningrad still stood. In January 1943, Soviet forces finally managed to open a narrow land corridor south of Lake Ladoga. Operation Spark broke the complete encirclement. The corridor was only a few miles wide and constantly under German artillery fire. But trains could run again. Supplies improved dramatically. The worst was over. But the siege continued. German forces still surrounded most of the city. Artillery barrages remained constant. Signs appeared on buildings warning which side of the street was most dangerous during shelling. People learned to read the sounds of incoming shells and judge where to run for cover. It wasn't until January 1944 that Soviet forces finally drove the Germans completely away from Leningrad. The siege officially ended on January 27, 1944, after 872 days. Nearly 2.5 years of encirclement. The longest siege of a major city in modern history. The death toll will never be known precisely. Soviet records were incomplete and often deliberately falsified. Conservative estimates suggest 800,000 civilians died. Higher estimates reach 1.5 million. Military casualties added another 500,000 or more. The total dead from the siege of Leningrad was greater than total American and British deaths in the entire war combined. Tanya Savacheva, the girl who'd recorded her family's deaths, was evacuated in summer 1942. But she was already dying from dystrophy and intestinal tuberculosis. Despite medical care, Tanya died on July 1, 1944, just 6 months after the siege ended. She was 14 years old. Her diary survived and became one of the most powerful documents of the siege. It's displayed in the museum at Piskaryovskoye Cemetery. The siege raises uncomfortable questions. Why didn't Stalin evacuate civilians before or during the early siege? He could have. In the first month, while routes were still open, over 1 million people could have been saved. But Stalin feared mass evacuation would hurt morale and make the military think the city would be abandoned. So civilians stayed and died. Hitler's deliberate starvation policy has led some historians to classify the siege as genocide. The Germans explicitly intended to kill Leningrad's population through starvation. This wasn't a side effect of military operations. It was the strategy. Hitler wanted the people dead. That's genocide. The siege shaped Soviet identity. Leningrad became a hero city, a symbol of Soviet resistance and sacrifice. The suffering was used for propaganda. Veterans were celebrated. But the full horror was censored. Cannibalism wasn't discussed publicly. The failures of Soviet leadership weren't examined. The siege became mythologized, the reality sanitized. Today, Piskaryovskoye Cemetery is a pilgrimage site. Russians visit to honor those who died. The memorial features a statue of the motherland, a woman mourning her dead. Behind her are 186 mass graves holding 500,000 victims. Every year on January 27th, the anniversary of the siege's end, thousands gather to remember. The siege of Leningrad was the deadliest siege in history. More died there than in any other siege, any other city, any other civilian disaster of World War II. And they died slowly, over 872 days, from hunger and cold and disease and shelling. They died while the world was fighting a war that most knew nothing about Leningrad's suffering. But Leningrad never surrendered. That's the legacy. Despite everything, the city held. The people endured. They starved, but they didn't surrender. They froze, but they kept working. They buried their families and kept living. The Germans expected the city to fall in weeks. It lasted 872 days. That endurance came at a horrific cost. But Leningrad stands today as St. Petersburg, rebuilt, alive, a testament to the people who refused to die.